Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chatbox. I'm David Cruz. Well, the world keeps spinning, another Earth Day, and with world leaders gathering to discuss the status of the global environment, we will take a look at what we're doing here in Jersey, both good and bad, to our planet. More on that in a bit, plus a discussion on the status and future of our 100-year-old colony, Puerto Rico. But we begin today with the guilty verdict in Minneapolis, still reverberating around the world. Relief on one hand and outrage on the other, as more police encounters since the verdict have resulted in the deaths of more young Black people. Joining us this week to talk more about this is Ryan Haygood. He is the president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Ryan, good to see you again, man. Thanks for coming on with us.
Great to see you, David. Thanks for having me on the show.
So we spoke earlier this week about the mixed feelings surrounding the verdict. On the one hand, relief that the jury seemed to get it right, but on the other hand, sadness that it took a video like the one that we saw to get that verdict, knowing that hundreds of other encounters are not captured on video. You must have been feeling both of those, I imagine.
I was, David. You know, I think the George Floyd murder was extraordinary in that, to your point, it was captured. You know, I have been heavy-hearted for the last year when you see the video of a grown man who's literally having their life crushed out of him, and he's so reduced that he calls on his mother, who has passed. Right? He couldn't think of anything but to call on his mother, who wasn't around. And what's really fascinating, David, about that case is that even though the video evidence was compelling, there wasn't a real case to be made in defense of former officer Chauvin's criminal act. There was uncertainty about what the jury would do. And that uncertainty, in light of this overwhelming evidence of murder, I think speaks to the real issues we have with our criminal justice system more broadly. That in this most extraordinary case where the evidence couldn't be more compelling, we still weren't sure if the jury would go the way that it ultimately went. And that, to your point, David, is because we have seen time and time again it go a different way. So, for example, the New York Times recently reported that since 2005, there have only been 7 convictions of murder for police officers who killed folks. That is, by their own estimate, 1 in 2,000. So it's exceedingly rare to see have happened what we saw happen earlier this week.
We're hearing a lot about justice versus accountability and how only one of those was achieved through this verdict. You shared that startling statistic, 1 in 2,000 conviction rate. So, I mean, that's not always the jury not seeing a video or not liking the victim. A lot of times the police are exonerated by department policies that allow for the use of chokeholds or other compression tactics. This is something lawmakers need to get involved in. And you talked about here in supposedly progressive New Jersey, how the legislature has been sitting on its hands over important bills meant to deal with this, right?
Absolutely, David. You and I have talked about this before, but so I'm 45 years old. I was in high school when Rodney King was brutalized now 30 years ago. And that too was captured on that old school version of the camcorder. You remember that? Yep. And 30 years later, we're having a very similar conversation. So to your point, legal justice was achieved in the jury's ruling, but real justice would mean that Mr. Floyd would still be alive and he'd have an opportunity to have his kids grow up with him and he'd see his grandkids and he'd do so much more, but he can't do that because he was murdered by former officer Chauvin, but he was also murdered by I think, a broader system of policing that has a real challenge with structural racism. You know, we're not talking about a few bad apples. I think what we're talking about with respect to policing is an orchard of poison trees that are diseased at the root, and they are producing, because of the culture that reinforces them, too often poisonous, deadly results. And so for us, you know, I think the conversation really has to be, George Floyd is not out there. George Floyd is not just Minnesota. It's not other states. We have to think about that as a cautionary tale, to your point, David, about what does New Jersey need to do to finally build accountability into policing, a profession that for too long has been largely accountability free.
There are some bills in the legislature right now concerning a civilian complaint review board, the use of chokeholds,
Sure.
qualified immunity. Those are all just languishing in the legislature in an election year.
And so, you know, part of what we do not want George Floyd's death to be in vain. If there's a lesson to be learned, it's that every state, there certainly has to be a federal response, but every state ought to be building the kind of system of policing with accountability that protects against a George Floyd being murdered by police in their states. And to your point, David, since his passing, since Mr. Floyd's passing a year ago, New Jersey has done precious little in the area of policing. Right after Mr. Floyd was murdered, we worked with legislators to get a bill introduced that would ban chokeholds in New Jersey. Very low lift. That bill, to your point, it hasn't moved. Shortly after that, there was a bill that would create a citizen complaint review board. And then came an introduction of a bill that would do away with qualified immunity. This is really the heart of police accountability, is that they have a significant degree of immunity from their misconduct. And there's no other profession quite like it. You know, David, you're a journalist. I'm a lawyer. If our conduct falls beneath a certain professional standard, there are real consequences, and professions are made better by accountability. I know a number of very good police officers who themselves want more accountability built into their profession. So New Jersey has a real decision to make here, which is not just do symbolic things, not just talk about how tragic it was that Mr. George Floyd and so many others have lost their lives, but let's protect against more of that happening in New Jersey by doing things like banning chokeholds, by doing away with qualified immunity, by providing greater transparency around police records, by holding law enforcement officials accountable if they're bystanders when there's police misconduct, and creating a citizen complaint review board for starters. And the last year, we've watched states do this. New York did some version of this. Then came New Mexico. My home state of Colorado did this. Other states are moving. New Jersey should be ahead of the curve as well.
All right, many rivers still to cross.
Absolutely.
Brian Haygood, thanks for a few minutes with us today.
Always.
Good to see you, man.
Thanks, David. Thanks for your work.